Okay, we are going to get started. I have hit the record button. My name is Dr. Carrie Arnold. I'm the Director of Certificate Coaching of Evidence-Based at Fielding Graduate University. I'm delighted that you guys are all here today. I'm very excited for this presentation. I think it's a topic that many of us can relate to. Dr. Lynn Harrison is our speaker, and a few things about Lynn. She has 25 years of experience as a coach and as a leader, and she's the recipient of 4 ICF Prism Awards. She is a PhD, she's a master certified coach, and she's a coaching supervisor. She did her dissertation study on the abrasive leader, and she's also recently written a chapter that Fielding produced this year, a monograph that many of our students contributed to. And Lynn was one of our writers. And so I'm very delighted that she's here tonight. I will be monitoring the chat. If you have questions, comments, let's use chat to interact. We are expecting a large group, and there'll be opportunities for Lynn to pause and ask for interaction. And I would also recommend that you keep yourself on mute for the duration of the webinar until invited to take off. Dr. Harrison, you ready to go? The floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Carrie. It's my pleasure to share with you today my learning about coaching abrasive leaders, drawn both from my doctoral research as well as from my experience as an executive coach. I'd like to start by just talking about why I chose this topic in the first place. I found when I was coaching executives this phenomenon where the leader in front of me was often really pleasant and even charming, and yet their 360 feedback indicated that people found them anything but. They were described as condescending, rude, overbearing, controlling, disdainful, humiliating of coworkers, moody. People used words like Jekyll and Hyde or even ogre to describe their boss. It seemed that even though these leaders could be congenial with customers, higher ups, or even me, they could be cantankerous and unpredictable to work with. In my research, I used the term abrasive to describe their behavior because over time, these kinds of leaders wear their coworkers down. They rub people the wrong way. Unlike bullies who target their anger towards specific individuals with ill intent, these leaders operated this way with pretty much any coworker who happened to get in their way when they felt annoyed or frustrated. So it was kind of equal opportunity abrasion as you might have. In many cases, they had very little idea of just how difficult they were to work with or how much harm they were actually doing to their coworkers, their organizations, or even themselves. They were often shocked and dismayed to learn that people feared them, avoided them, or plain hated them. As a coach, I wondered what caused this behavior in the first place. And I was also keen to figure out how best to help these kind of people change. So as part of this presentation, I'll be talking about how coaching the abrasive leader is different from other kinds of coaching that we do. So I conducted 2 primary studies that I'll share with you today. One was a phenomenological study of leaders formerly perceived to be abrasive. So those were deep interviews with leaders. The other was a triangulated case study where I looked at what the perceptions of abrasive leaders, their client sponsors, and their coaches. And then I've learned a lot just working with these kinds of leaders. And I did training back in 2009 with Dr. Crawshaw at the Boss Whispering Institute, and Dr. Crawshaw actually did her doctoral research in this area at Fielding. You'll notice that I chose to work with formerly abrasive leaders. This was because I found it was hard to find study participants that would self-identify as abrasive, nor did companies want to volunteer that they had abrasive managers in their employ. Besides all of that, most currently abrasive leaders are not particularly self-reflective, or they think perhaps what they're doing is actually working for them. The phenomenological study was interesting because it looked at the lived experience of abrasive leaders, how they perceive the causes and nature of their behavior. And this is something that was largely missing in the literature about aggression in the workplace. Understandably, the focus had been more on the impact on victims. So in terms of the screening criteria for the studies, there were 5 main ones that I looked for. One was the tendency of overreaction, so flying off the handle when there was a mistake, poor results, or a delay. Over control, which was checking and revising people's work, micromanaging other people. Threatening, so telling people that if they don't shape up, they can ship out or they'll be shipped out. Public humiliation, so dressing down poor performers in front of their peers. Condescension was common too, a tone that inferred that the people around them were stupid or lazy or couldn't keep up with them. Another common feature was that these individuals were impatient. I remember one of the leaders I interviewed said, you know, people told him he didn't suffer fools gladly. And he joked a little bit and he said, that was just a nice way of saying I can be a real jerk. The impact of these behaviors, as you can imagine, is quite extensive. Coworkers become distressed and engage in workarounds, ask for transfers to other departments, go on stress leave, and talented employees leave for less toxic, healthier environments. So what did the research find out about the causes of this behavior and how people change? Well, my background is in organizational systems. So I was really interested in whether this was a case of disposition or what was going on in the environment. And, you know, was this a case of a problematic personality, the proverbial rotten apple, or was it a case of a bad barrel? So a system that somehow encouraged or endorsed the behavior, or at the very least turned a blind eye to it. And it seemed from what I found that it was both personality factors and the system which created this perfect storm. So I'd like to look at the dispositional factors first. So these were individuals that self-admitted that they were intense, driven, they liked to win. Their greatest fear was failing or being seen as incompetent. They were usually technically very capable, and in fact, they'd been promoted to management, not because they were good leaders, but because they got things done. The problem was that once they became a leader, they were supposed to get things done with or through others and not just be an uber individual contributor. Interestingly, some of them had dissonance about using aggressive tactics to get things done. So standing in a place of competence, they didn't have a lot of tolerance for people who didn't work as hard as they did, who weren't as quick on their feet, or who made errors. And they often felt justified in calling people out for that. Some of them felt deep shame in hearing that they were feared or despised by their coworkers. It wasn't that they didn't care about people, it's just they placed much more importance on tasks than on relationships. Another common feature was that they struggled to manage their emotions. So as much as they could be charming when needed, the pressure of having to get things done through other people often led to angry outbursts. And I should point out that we're not talking about occasional outbursts, we're talking about a pattern of behavior here. At the same time, these are not individuals that would fit the diagnosis of psychopathic or sociopathic. However, some of their behaviors were certainly consistent with some of that and in that realm. So here's kind of what they described for me would typically happen when they had one of their outbursts. And you may be familiar with this cycle. It's sometimes called the arousal cycle, and it's been around for some time, but it fairly well reflected what typically happened. So these individuals were pretty wound tight to start with. And so here they are kind of stressed anyway, and they'd be going along and some kind of incident would spark irritation. And that could be that somebody made a mistake or dropped the ball with the customer, something that upset them. And they often reported that they had this somatic signal that they were going to lose it, but they just could not seem to manage it. And before they knew it, it would spiral and their emotions escalated, and then it would lead to some kind of angry response, a cutting remark, throwing down a notepad, swearing, raising their voice at people. At the time, they often felt justified in being angry, thinking to themselves, well, a mistake was made, this problem wasn't necessary. And so then later, when they started to calm down and their body went back to its regular heart rate level and adrenaline level, they would start to feel some level of remorse and say to themselves, well, I could have handled that better. They would admit that. At the same time, they might think, well, I wouldn't have to get mad if that person had just done their job. And often these leaders saw themselves as heroes who were valiantly trying to save the company. And here they are surrounded by people who don't seem to appreciate all they're doing. It was interesting, one of the people I interviewed actually got charged with bullying. And the couple of the people who had accused her, she had saved their job when the company was going through cutbacks. And so she just really felt it was unfair that they would accuse her of having these terrible leadership tactics when here she'd done all she could to save the company financially. As you can imagine, when these leaders acted this way, it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the more they yelled and got upset, the more anxious people would become around them, which affected their performance, their confidence, and so the cycle just continues. So now let's look at the systemic or organizational factors. And I have to say there was very little about this available. Most of the books had these incendiary titles like, you know, psychopathic bosses and all this sort of focus on these disordered, horrible people who should never have been put in leadership positions in the first place. But it was interesting when I looked at the organizational system they were in, one of the most common things was these leaders were promoted for their technical skills and had very little preparation to be a leader. When I asked them about what being a leader meant to them, they'd say stuff like, you got things done. The organizations they worked for, despite avowals that people are the most important asset, were actually mostly concerned with the results generated, particularly financial results. And they had this sort of short-term focus on, you know, just hitting the quarterly targets, with very little concern for how those results were accomplished. So these were people sometimes that got promoted and promoted. I had one person I started to work with who was highly abrasive, who'd just come back from Europe where he had received an award for his leadership because he got things done. The work environment was often very competitive, with people vying with one another. And there was kind of this looking out for number one versus the team's well-being. And sometimes that looking out for number one was bringing in customers, getting more clients, keeping them happy, but not this kind of we concept of working together to do that. There was a stark absence, this is one of the most common things, stark absence of direct and honest feedback. And often, especially when these people were in senior levels, they were exempted from performance appraisals and, you know, reviews, 360s that the managers lower down had. And often, because they're in senior level positions, people were reluctant to give them honest feedback. And the problem often went on way too long. In many cases, or some cases, maybe not many, the person had a protector, someone senior in the company who either behaved similarly or lack the ability to deliver the hard feedback. Sometimes they actually liked having a person like this because that person went out and did the dirty work and shook people up and got things done. And often these people were extremely hardworking individuals, which made them a bit brittle. So there was a lot of stress and change going on in the organization. Tensions were high all around them. And, you know, I've heard reports that abrasive behavior is increasing during these times we're going through because the level of stress is so high in so many organizations with all the uncertainty and rapid change. Beyond the organizational systems, societal beliefs also had a role. Often these leaders grew up with mental models about work like it's a jungle out there, eat or be eaten. On the part of coworkers, there were beliefs like put up and shut up if you want to keep your job, do it because the boss says so. And I looked at people in leadership roles all in different countries across the globe. And the problem appeared to be more common in societies where the power distance between bosses and employees were greater. So it was harder in those circumstances to go in and sit down with the boss and say, hey, you know, the way you acted in that meeting had this impact on me. People just didn't go there with their boss. So how and when did they change? Typically, change happened when the system finally took action. And the studies reported that, you know, when they got their clear feedback from a 360, first of all, many of them did not realize that they were causing this level of harm. They knew they're tough or that they can be hard on people, but they did not realize the harm, the depth of the harm they were causing. Now, there are those people out there that don't care about that kind of thing, but for the most part, the people I talked to were concerned about that and the extent to which their behavior disrupted the workplace. So what was kind of interesting is, you know, I can think of one leader who was just appalled that people thought that she was this mean person who didn't care about people's feelings. She felt deep shame and was very upset about that. Another leader said, people should leave their problems at home. You know, we've got work to do. But what was motivating for her was learning that her behavior was so disruptive, was so distressing that everybody shut down. And so they didn't exchange ideas. So the quality of the science that they were doing together was affected. So a different kind of motivation there. People said that although having an incentive to change, like you need to change your leadership if you want to keep your job here or if you want to stay in a leadership role here, they said having a gun pointed to their head to start coaching wasn't so great. What worked better was that it was very clear they needed to change, but that there was support for them in changing. And in fact, you know, belief that they could change. I think that, you know, one of the things that's important to remember with these kind of leaders is that just because they become aware that there's a problem doesn't mean they know how to change. And Dr. Laura Crawshaw used to say, and I think it's quite true, it's like telling a drowning person to swim. These are very smart people in many ways, but this aspect of leadership is very difficult for them. It also helped when they had the backing of their boss to go into coaching. So just continuing on, so what's different about coaching an abrasive leader? And we'll open it up for questions after I do this next little piece here. So as with any coaching engagement, you need to have a good fit between the coach and client. Ideally, the client gets to choose their coach, but this coach needs to be skilled in doing this kind of work. It's not for the faint of heart because these are smart and often challenging clients who can smell fear. And the client may not be used to opening up, discussing feelings, or even noticing what's going on in their body in reaction to stress. Often they lack insight into the impact they're having on other people. So they can be churlish and difficult with their coach. They may also be reeling from the shock of finding out that they're failing as leaders and they haven't failed at anything before. So the coach needs to be able to create this strong, safe learning container for the coaching to succeed, but be able to stand in that place. I remember one time I was meeting with an abrasive leader and they'd sent me to the wrong floor for the reception area. And so that meant I was like 3 minutes late by the time I got to the right floor and I met with her. And I'll never forget her stiletto heels, click, 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 click. And she was so annoyed because we were starting the meeting late and what kind of a flake was this coach anyway? And, you know, so often as a coach, you can't let that throw you off in working with these strong individuals. As you can imagine, individual readiness is a key factor. The abrasive leader needs to be willing and ready to learn and change and make time for this. They need to see coaching as important and not just a nice to do to keep HR happy and off their backs. In addition to hearing the message that change is required and not optional, the leader may need to be ready to do some mea culpa with coworkers who have been harmed by this behavior. And in fact, part of the upfront assessment is, has it gone on so long that it's not reparable? In addition, there needs to be organizational readiness, which is a commitment. Like this is not a, let's do a 360 and have half a dozen sessions and they're done. So it needs to be done properly. And you also can't just have it as something where the boss goes, okay, I've hired an executive coach, that's taken care of that. They need to continue to be involved and the company needs to be willing to participate in a thorough 360, providing this leader with much needed feedback. And so I've headed down this path before and not got that organizational readiness really nailed down. And then I've gone to do the 360 and people are like, I'm not going there, or even the boss doesn't get around to completing their survey. I use the leadership circle, or they don't participate in their narrative 360. So it really needs to be well contracted. After the 360, the boss needs to participate in a three-way conversation with the abrasive leader, the coach, make sure there's alignment about the coaching goals and the leader's ongoing involvement or the boss's ongoing involvement. I also use a stakeholder-centered process where selected colleagues provide ongoing feedback to the leader, which is really valuable in helping them hold the course. So it's a pretty comprehensive process. So what else is particularly important in this kind of coaching? So once it's underway, the coaching needs to address not just the deeper stuff, the mental models and values and so on, what we might call the vertical development side, but also behavior, horizontal development. So what I found is sometimes these leaders just need stuff to get them out of the gate, like counting to 10 in a meeting where they're frustrated before they respond, taking a deep breath, waiting for others to speak before weighing in, listening fully to others. These are smart, quick people, and they think they've got the answer before the person's got 4 words out of their mouths. So learning to slow down. And this can be a big change because they may be used to being quite blunt and direct and calling a spade, and that may even, in fact, be how they were raised, and that may be how other leaders in their company behave. Ideally, the work should incorporate the whole person and address lifestyle-related strategies, because this often comes out of anxiety and stress. So the coach needs to be on the lookout for any signs of burnout, anxiety, and depression, because sometimes these hard-driving leaders push themselves to the brink of exhaustion. And unhealthy coping mechanisms like drinking, substance abuse can be present. And in those circumstances, therapy rather than coaching may be needed, or in addition to. I had one guy who was very abrasive and worked super hard, and he blew up at a couple of junior architects in his company, and the bosses sent him to a lounge area to go cool down. And they said, help yourself to a beer in the fridge that they kept there, and it was just more of what was not working for this person. To stand in the fire with a client is doing this kind of work and often holds a senior position. They have a lot of power often. The coach needs to be both courageous and confident. Coaching won't be successful with a coach who lacks the personal authority to be both kind and direct with the client. So your own ongoing development is important. Working with a supervisor who can help is often really an important thing to have going on. To help hold the course, there should be check-ins with the stakeholders every 3 months or so. The boss should be part of the debriefs. And as with any kind of coaching, the coach would never meet with the client sponsor or anyone else without the coachee present. And usually I get the coachee to lead the discussion and keep all the feedback reports confidential unless they've decided to share them. So, you know, what I want to emphasize here is it's important not only to coach the individual, but to coach the system and look at and be willing to talk to them about feedback mechanisms, reward systems, even their management selection, because it may not be congruent with what you're trying to support this change around. When I interview stakeholders, I will quite often ask them something like, have you shared this feedback with the leader? And discover that, no, this is a culture where people haven't. And they're looking for someone else, maybe the coach, to share that kind of feedback. So it can be an opportunity as a coach to coach the stakeholders. And in many cases, the organization has a mea culpa to do because they've let this problem go on far too long, and they may have even rewarded the behavior that's ultimately harmful. So final slide here, what are the rewards of this? Well, if it works, and you know, usually these individuals don't become the person who's going to be at the concierge desk at the Four Seasons Hotel, but they can move quite a distance in many cases. And so it's really rewarding to see that happen. And the organization, instead of having to let this hardworking, highly skilled person go, they actually can get them turned around. And I've seen some highly abrasive leaders become impressive leaders. But it does take real work and commitment. It reduces coworker stress and the time that is spent dealing with a problem leader, and it helps people get focused back on their work. This kind of stuff is very distracting and very stressful for the people around the leader. And so not only is the health and well-being of coworkers and the organization preserved and its reputation, but what is also been rewarding for me is seeing that the health of the abrasive leader is improved as well. They stop making work such a central part of their life and start doing other things like mindfulness or yoga or going for walks, or they start taking vacations, not working through every weekend. Their self-care starts to shift, which in turn helps their behavior change. So it's really, for me anyway, as a coach, super rewarding to see that. And I think that's all I had, Carrie. If we've got some questions, I'm happy to answer any of them.
Yeah, there's been some great interaction in the chat, and there's a couple. So let's start with Catherine. And Catherine, feel free to take yourself off chat to add more, but she's wondering this dilemma of how do you balance competitiveness, industry competitiveness, with a leader's need to be whole and self-aware, and how do you manage that polarity?
Yeah. That's a great question. As you can see, like the system sometimes is just supporting this behavior in lots of ways. I worked with this one person who was so important to the company because of her technical expertise. They did not want the competition to get this person. And at the same time, this person couldn't do all the work. And so the other talented people around this leader started to leave and did not want to work with them. So then the company had a problem. So they really needed to do an intervention with this person where the person learned, look, you cannot continue to behave this way because it's incongruent with our values and it's causing other people to get upset. So the person was kind of mad about it all at the first. But then over time, as she realized that this was actually counterproductive to be acting this way, she started to open up more to what people had to offer her and started to actually think more, because this is where the mental model comes in, like, what is a really good leader? Do I want to be a really good leader? What is it that gets in the way of me being a good leader? And so many of the times it's about being anxious and wound up. And when a person is so wound up and lacks the resources to be able to calm themselves down when they get triggered, they need to step back and go, why am I that wound up all the time to even start with? And do I want to change it? Now, if they don't want to change, it's like any coaching we do, right? You can have the best coach in the world, but if the person's not interested in changing, then it comes down to, is the company going to continue to keep this person with all the damage they're causing? Is this person going to opt out and go elsewhere where they can continue to be the way they are? It can come down to that. I don't know if that answers your question, Catherine, but the person needs to start to look deeper at what's generating this kind of behavior that isn't working for them, or certainly is not working for the people around them, and then it's not working for them.
Yeah, and Catherine, feel free to take yourself off mute. We have a few more questions, but I want to make sure you feel like this question was appropriately addressed based on what you
Yeah, that was fantastic. Thank you so much, Lynn. I'm actually going to type in a couple follow-up questions so that they can go kind of around the room and get some other voices too. But thank you so much. This is really interesting.
Lynn, there's another question, and this is a really good one. You know, your research was on the previous abrasive leader, or those who had self-identified as being one. Can you share a success story of someone you actually coached who was, you know, in that space of being abrasive, and how did you go about doing that?
Well, I would say that many of the people I worked with in the study were still somewhat abrasive. However, the way that they came into my study was quite often through coaches who'd worked with them, and so they'd made quite a bit of a shift. And pretty much every one of them said to me, I know I can go back to that behavior if I'm not careful. Because they've done it a long time, right? So they said, I have to watch myself. I'm not completely out of the woods. So I would say some of the people in the study still were quite capable of being abrasive. And quite frankly, a lot of leaders I talk to say, I can be like that. I've yelled at people. I've lost my temper. I've micromanaged. I've been condescending, and so on. Very often when I'm working with the leader, they will come in just being told that they would benefit from some executive coaching. And so they don't know what the feedback's going to come back like. And that's why I was saying at the beginning, like, it was kind of weird. Like, I'm sitting in front of someone who seems quite charming and articulate and witty. And then we do the 360. And that is such an eye-opener for so many of them. Because, as I said, these are people that are usually very good at everything they've taken on in life. And they do not realize just how off-putting they are or how difficult they are. So boom, we've got an abrasive leader on our hands. When I'm talking to a company beforehand and they think they maybe have an abrasive leader, I use a little 4-quadrant model, and I say, so on a scale of 1 to 10, how competent is this person? How skilled are they at delivering results? And they may put them up at, you know, an 8 or a 10 on that. And then I ask them, so on a scale of 1 to 10, how about their conduct? How they reflect the values that your company says it holds in terms of how it treats its people. And if that's down below a 5, then we've got an abrasive leader situation, and the company needs to decide before they invest in the coaching whether or not the benefits they get from this person's technical expertise or ability to make the money, deliver results, will offset the problem situation with their conduct, and how much do they believe that that person can change. Now, if the person doesn't want to change, then it's a waste of money and they're better to exit the person.
So you've sort of touched on this, but I'm going to ask a question that Lily posted, which is she's curious about the culture that rewards this kind of behavior and the modeling that this sets up for others. So if there's one in the system, it will likely breed more. And what's your reaction to that?
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole thing about it needing to be not just individual coaching, it's system coaching. And so very often when I'm brought in to do this kind of work, there's a connection with more than just the individual who's wanting the coaching. And so I think as coaches, we need to be willing to be really courageous around what we're noticing in the system that's setting this up. Maybe people within the system aren't going to call it out, but you know, I worked in one company where the top guy who was on the top floor, and it was a big open atrium, used to yell, and you could hear it reverberating through the entire building. And I mean, if you've got that behavior going on at the top of the house, and you have younger managers looking at, well, what's it mean to lead here? Well, there you go. And if that person isn't willing to change, or the organization isn't willing to look at, well, heck, we promote these people that everybody knows are jerks, it's very hard to have sustained change.
Michelle asked a really good question. Michelle, feel free to take yourself off mute too. What if it's the CEO and there's not a coach involved? Who's supposed to give them that feedback? At least I think that's what, Michelle, you're really trying to get.
Yeah, and quite often that's the case. And what I've noticed sometimes it's maybe a small family business, and the CEO started it or is the founder, and not even, you know, the people near the top are willing to tell this person that how their behavior is affecting people, because there's a lot at stake for them, to be honest. And quite frankly, as a coach, you could find yourself, you know, being sent out the door if you don't say things the right way. But then, you know, the interesting thing is if you can have those people be part of the stakeholder process where you're interviewing them and you start to have conversations with them, it is an in to help them start to recognize what it's costing them to engage in this kind of pattern. Because there is a cost, right? It's not just you're going to have people that are unhappy and stressed. They actually don't perform as well. There's you know, poor citizenship behavior that results. You have people going on stress leave. You have people who are afraid to speak up and point out an error that's taken place. It costs the company in all kinds of ways beyond people's satisfaction levels.
So you mentioned family, and there is a question from Susan. Do you ever actually include family members or other personal relationships in the 360 stakeholder work?
I haven't typically when it's been, you know, it's not a family business, but when it is a family business, it's kind of interesting because often the spouse can be the person who goes to that CEO founder and says stuff that other people have been afraid to say, and they've been kind of noticing but haven't brought up. But no, I don't usually go beyond. However, what I would say is more often than not, these clients have said, this is exactly what my spouse has been telling me. or, you know, so-and-so so happy I'm working with you because he or she sees me working super hard and I come home exhausted and cranky and I'm not the person I used to be.
So Miranda, if you're willing, if you could take yourself off mute and say a little bit more about your question around explaining the 360.
Hi, Lynn.
Hi.
So I was just curious, a lot of times you said they don't recognize this behavior in themselves, or, you know, they could be cheerful and, you know, willing to work with others, but then when you do the 360, then things change. Could you just briefly cover again, what is the 360?
Sure. Yeah, so when, you know, very often these individuals, when it's called for, they can be very congenial, right? When sometimes customers just love them, clients love them. They're often very well liked by the senior people in the company because they don't act this way with them. The 360, I usually use two different processes. I use the leadership circle, which is a survey, and then I use what I call narrative feedback, which is interviews. And it's a great question because I do my 360 interviews differently than I do with regular clients. Rather than just bringing back something that has a nice balance between here's your strengths and, you know, here are the areas of development, I really focus in on what are the problem areas, because that's where the emphasis needs to be for these leaders. Everybody already knows that they're organized and they're technically superior and, you know, they understand the industry and all that stuff. What they don't know and what they need is behaviorally descriptive feedback. And I use as close as I can to the words of the people I interview, like, you know, when you tell someone that their ideas are stupid, that causes me to shut down. Like really specific, because it's kind of like they don't have the radar to recognize, and then they'll say to me, well, that was a stupid idea. I didn't want to waste our time on it. And then that's a coachable moment, right? So, you know, what's the impact of people shutting down? So the feedback in the interviews is really powerful because it's very specific and helps them see and hear what they are not seeing and hearing. I love the leadership circle because it gives this leader a picture they can see really quickly, and the bottom part of the graph is reactive tendencies. So very typically these abrasive leaders, their wheel will be green in the bottom right hand side, right? So the controlling tendencies, if you're familiar with Karen Horney's work, the controlling tendencies when they're under stress, so taking charge, grabbing the wheel, high perfectionism, domination, and then also the protective strategy of sometimes being viewed as emotionally distant and critical and uncaring, because they go to this place of it's just about the task, not about the people. So yeah, so when they see that and they get that very specific behaviorally descriptive feedback, they go, holy crap, right?
So I know Lisa had a couple follow-up questions specific to that in the 362. So Lisa, if you'd like to take yourself off mute.
All right, yeah, thanks, Lynn, for your presentation. Also had a question about how sometimes the leaders themselves may not deem their behavior as appropriate or as abrasive. Now, you might have touched upon this as well. And maybe have they also talked about how it might have impacted them personally and professionally, and maybe how it stemmed from their childhood or how they developed the behaviors? Is it connected to other disorders, cultural gender bias? And that kind of led into my question on when they do receive that feedback, is it anonymous, and do they kind of take accountability for it, or do they kind of shirk the responsibility on, you know, these costs aren't valid because, you know, other people are involved in this process?
Right. Oh, two really great questions. I'll maybe take the first part, which is like, do they talk about where this came from? Absolutely. It's not like in coaching we're going back to do family of origin work, but very often what people will share is, I used to be in the military, very hierarchical kind of work environment where, you just do what you're told, and that's the boss's job, is to tell you what to do and to kick butt if necessary. Or they came from families where there was a lot of anger and inability to rein in emotions and have calm conversations. They just did not learn stuff like that growing up. Sometimes they'll talk about coming from a background where they're expected to be really successful. And so they spent their whole lives trying to prove to everybody, that achiever adult development level. They're like stuck there with what people think about their level of performance. Or they came from a background where people told them they'd never amount to anything. So they have this huge intensity around being successful, getting stuff done. So there's all kinds of kind of rich stuff that helps me as a coach kind of really appreciate this human being in front of me who's behaving so badly, and where that came from. Sometimes they were bullied themselves. Sometimes they came from such dysfunctional backgrounds that they went and they joined a company that was full of a bunch of abrasive bullying people, because that's familiar to them. So there's lots of different things about that. And then the second part about the, sorry, what was the second part? It was more about what happens in the 360, right? And
Yeah.
shock.
If you describe the cost to them of their behaviors, do they take accountability for it, or do they say it's a result of other people, and is the feedback they receive anonymous?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The part of it is like how it's set up, right? So at the beginning, if it's set up in a way like, this may not be what you're intending, but this is the impact you're having. That can be very helpful to people, just to kind of hear that, and they go, okay, that's interesting. I'm surprised, I'm shocked, like I've never had a mean bone in my body. I'm just like all about getting the job done. So they don't get it and they're shocked. And so part of the work at the beginning, before you can go deep with the person, is just actually helping them get through that emotional numbing that they're feeling about hearing this news. Some people get mad, like, why didn't anybody tell me? How can this be true? I am at this level in this company. I've been promoted. I've been successful. I make this company more money than anybody else. Different people react with different defense mechanisms. Some people rationalize it, right? There's all these lazy people out here, and if I had a better team, we wouldn't be talking about this. So they can start from all different places around something that can be really hard and painful to hear.
So then there's a couple other questions. One sort of a follow-up to what you just said, but I'll state both of them. So Katie's wondering do they often look to you for how to make the change and how to make amends and what your role is in that? And then the other question came from Susan, which is a really good one, and that is, are you noticing any changes in the recruitment process to kind of identify some of this up front? And so those are very different questions, but wanted to get them both in front of you.
Okay, so I'll grab the second one first, because very often the people who get all the complaints are people in HR. And so the people who are responsible for talent acquisition and even the branding and so on. So they're often very concerned and central to this. The bosses may quite like what's going on because this person gets results, but the HR people are saying, yeah, they get results, but people don't want to work here because they've heard it's a toxic work environment. We cannot continue with this. Or we've got several leaders that, just aren't cutting it, and we've got good people leaving or not wanting to work with them. We need to look at how we're selecting these individuals. And as the coach, if you have a relationship with those folks, that's a great opportunity for you to help them look at, okay, so how are you choosing leaders? Is it based on who makes the most money or who hits their targets, or is there a more complete picture? And then do you actually train and support people in moving into those roles? And so what was the first part again, Carrie?
Do they look to you for the how?
Oh, do I?
They do.
Yeah.
Like, do you
Yeah.
solve it for them? Because they probably want you to.
Well, as I said at the beginning, you know, there is the deeper stuff that's their work to do. And at the beginning, some of them want a formula. Like, could you tell me what I'm supposed to do so I don't blow up? And it may not seem consistent with most executive coaching work, which is really not about telling and stuff like that. But honestly, some of them aren't sure where to start. They have not paid, you know, so in the coaching you can do work with like, so what's going on in your body right now? Because they have gotten disconnected from their somatic cues that they're starting to get wound up. Or, you know, they may not have thought about the counting to 10 or taking a breath. Or, you know, certainly the here and now in your coaching, if you notice they're cutting you off, or you notice they're not really listening, or they're getting distracted and looking around, like there are moments, what's happening in the here and now with them is one of the richest places to do that kind of teaching without it being, you know, here's how you have to go out and behave. These are senior people, but they still have learning to do in this area.
Yeah, and Dr. J. Rick Day kind of references that too, and feel free to take yourself off mute, but he or she mentions it's more about the with them, what's in it for the leader, and making that connection. And then there was one other comment about what are some of the techniques you're using specifically to build this self-awareness, and Michelle asked that question.
Yeah, so I think the main thing about the what's in it for me is that the organization needs to be willing to draw a line in the sand. If you want to continue in a leadership role, this needs to change. It's not a slap on the wrist, or it would be nice if you could round off those rough edges. It needs to be absolutely direct. This needs to change. We will not tolerate this kind of behavior. So that's kind of a good incentive for people who like to perform. On the personal level, as I mentioned, for some people, it's like, oh, I actually don't like being hated by people. So that's a motivation for me to be different, because I don't want to be like that in the world. That's not the kind of legacy I want to have. I don't want people to remember me as the worst boss they ever had. For other people, it's not that altruism, it's more, I'm realizing I'm actually compromising the results I get when I'm so domineering or I'm so intimidating that people don't speak up. That's a different reason for wanting to change, but it's still a good reason.